So I recently finished reading Cultish by Amanda Montell, and it occurred to me while I was reading it, because it does have an extensive section on Scientology, that it's been about 10 years since my obsession with Scientology first began. I know a lot of people are really interested in Scientology. It's, I think, just sort of an object of fascination for us and our culture in general. But when I say I've been obsessed, I think I mean a level of interest in this topic that goes beyond what most people, I think, have invested in it, unless they themselves have been victims of its past alleged abuse. And I should say alleged. We know how folks at that particular organization roll, so I should mention here, everything that I'm going to talk about is alleged, based on reports from other people that I find personally credible, but I'm sure the church would refute a lot of what we're going to talk about. That being said, my obsession with this started about 10 years ago when YouTube served me a video on Mark Bunker's channel. I assume it was likely the infamous Jason Begay interview, but I do know that once I stumbled upon this topic, I went fully down the rabbit hole. My early obsessions included Tori Christman's videos, but really also that Jason Begay interview. I literally probably have seen that interview hundreds of times at this point. And quickly from there, I curated a YouTube list with like hundreds of videos in it. I've since culled it down to some of my favorites, but I still have dozens and dozens of videos from former Scientologists saved. I also became a faithful reader of the blog, The Underground Bunker, which Tony Ortega runs. I quickly consumed as many books that had been published on the topic as I could, most of which I found pretty disappointing until Lawrence Wright's Going Clear. I feel like a lot of the books that got published up to that point didn't get a lot of things, just basic facts about the church right, including Inside Scientology by Janet Reitman. I found that one to be particularly disappointing, though it did have a few good nuggets. So all that to say, I have been a longtime connoisseur of all things related to Scientology and ex-members talking about their experiences with this particular philosophy slash religion slash potentially cult. At least cult-ish. And so I thought maybe we could talk today about why I have been so fascinated slash obsessed with this particular group for so long. I definitely know the main reason, but there are actually two other ones I want to explore before we get into that, because I think actually Scientology has become sort of a mirror for me to examine some things about myself that I think I had a hard time putting words to until I started looking further into it. So the first area that I think fascinates me about Scientology is it as what I believe Larry Wright has referred to as a kind of psychological folk art. And I think that Amanda Montell gets into some of this in her book Cultish, but in general, I am fascinated with the fact that this whole movement only became a thing because of who L. Ron Hubbard was, his own personal hangups and peccadillos, and kind of the time and place he was living in. So if you don't know anything about L. Ron Hubbard, dude is a trip. He is one of the most interesting people I've ever read about, and I don't necessarily mean interesting as a compliment, but he is a very fascinating fellow. I think part of his psychological makeup that makes him such an interest of fascination for me is the fact that he was living in a time that was beginning to have language around psychology and psychiatry without having some of the kind of ground rules that we now have an understanding of 70 to 90 years on. L. Ron Hubbard himself, I am certainly not a professional in this area. I am speaking only as somebody who has gone to therapy, as somebody whose best friend has a doctorate in psychology and therefore has spent a lot of time talking about these things. It is my layperson's opinion that L. Ron Hubbard was a man who had deep psychological issues that I think he was kind of seeking to address throughout his life. This is something in particular that I think Lawrence Wright really draws a compelling picture of in his book Going Clear, and this is also translated into the documentary, that L. Ron Hubbard was somebody who described things that seem to indicate that maybe he was hearing voices in his head, who had this series of affirmations that are truly wild if you ever read some of them, and somebody who literally wrote to the US government after his military service saying that he was in deep psychological distress, that he was experiencing suicidal ideation, and that he felt like he desperately needed the help of psychologists of some kind. And actually, he only wrote to the US government, I believe, in 1947, but in 1945, he actually spent time with Jack Parsons, who, if you don't know who that is, another super interesting dude, but he was a literal rocket scientist who helped figure out the science behind solid rocket fuel, I believe, so that we were eventually able to go to the moon. So very, very smart guy, but he was also fascinated with the work of Aleister Crowley, who is a famous occultist from Britain who he was in communication with. And Jack Parsons was involved in essentially trying to bring about the end of the world through a magic sex ritual. And L. Ron Hubbard in 1945 went to his house and started trying to help him do that. Basically, it sounds like Parsons would, how to say this delicately, pull the page, if you will. While he was doing that, L. Ron Hubbard would like take notes and look for signs on the astral plane that something was happening. So L. Ron Hubbard was involved in a whole thing there prior to him asking for psychological help from the US government. All that to say, it seems like he's somebody who genuinely searching for help. And he was not unique in this. Especially after World War II, there were thousands upon thousands of soldiers who came back who were deeply traumatized by the experience of war that they had. You can see this in a lot of films at the time. Basically, there were tons of people who were looking for something after World War II. After the trauma of what the world learned about the Holocaust, the atom bombs being dropped, etc., it seems like there were a lot of people who were really in need of psychological help. And so when L. Ron Hubbard's book Dianetics came out in 1950, it was an instant smash hit. It was sort of like a summer craze, it seems like. It came out in the spring, and then by the end of the summer, there's this big demonstration where he was supposed to be showing off what the first person who he cleared, showing off what they could do, and it was a total failure. This person was I think she was a physics student, and she couldn't remember any of the formulas. When Hubbard turned her back on her, somebody called out, "What color was his tie?" And she couldn't remember, even though when you are cleared, essentially he conceptualized the brain as a kind of computer, and that you should be able to have perfect recall, and she couldn't even remember what the color of his tie was. But anyway, Dianetics was a huge runaway bestseller over that summer. A ton of self-help Dianetics groups grew out of that, and I think it speaks to both Hubbard himself looking for something psychologically, but really the whole quote-unquote science of Dianetics, speaking to kind of a cultural need and this desire to have certainty in the face of a world that was very uncertain in the wake of World War II. So I have read Dianetics, and it is not an experience I would recommend to anybody because it is literal nonsense. It's one of those books that feels like word salad. That's actually, I don't think, a coincidence. This is part of what Amanda Montell's book dissects, is this idea of cult-ish. So both she has movements in here that she talks about that seem cult-like but maybe aren't strictly cults, but also this idea that part of what cults do, or what cult-like groups do, is they create their own language. And Dianetics, I think, is a great example of that, because honestly, it is incredibly difficult to even get through if you take at face value the meaning of the words that are on the page. But people were really into it because people were clamoring for some sort of psychological relief. There were very few psychologists or psychiatrists around relative to the overall population of the US at this point, and those who were there were very expensive and not necessarily accessible to a GI Joe coming back from war. This also speaks to an area that's very interesting to me, which is sort of the intersection between magic, science, and religion, which I think, given some of what I've told you about Hubbard's background so far, you can maybe guess why I think Scientology plays into that Venn diagram so interestingly. Because in today's society, magic is supposed to have nothing to do with science. But really in the ancient world, magic, science, and religion were all sort of inextricably bound. And I think we like to think of, I don't know, in the Industrial Revolution onwards, that distinction being a much brighter one between those different areas. But the reality is, if you read about the history of science, you very quickly see that that intersection has always been pretty overlapping. Even though today we have a lot stricter sense of what those boundaries look like, and we have a lot more rigorous methods for science. I mean, honestly, the proof is in the pudding. The fact that I am sitting here in air conditioning, recording into a camera that I'm going to upload onto the internet. Obviously, a lot of our methods of science have gotten way better, but if you look at the history of how we have gotten to this point, it is not just like this steady, always getting kind of clearer and clearer and clearer where science versus magic and religion all distinguish each other. Rather, there's been a long history, I think, of sort of folk art science, or the language of science being appropriated into more magical or religious practices. I think of the book Age of Wonder, which talks about the real boom of the modern modern scientific movements that we would think of today, and how tied into a sense of awe of the natural world, but also sort of religious motivations of wanting to understand creation in some way. Then you look at something like the history of the last big pandemic that we as a world have gone through, and you can very clearly see, even though their scientific methods were a lot better, in terms of the number of people trained to implement those methods, the public's belief in those methods, etc., really led to a lot of folk art type science in medicine. Which, by the way, if you want to ever listen to a podcast that gets into that all the time, I highly recommend Sawbones. I'm also currently listening to the audiobook that they put out, which is really fun, but it goes into sort of like the long history of sort of folk science that has existed, particularly here in the US, but really around the world. And then something else that this particular book dives a lot into is this relationship between the wellness culture we have today and capitalism. So as a lot of those wellness movements are manifested in things like MLMs, how they have really sort of like a religious type belief to them as they are appropriating what probably would be best thought of as a kind of magical thinking under the guise of science. I think this book really explores the intersection of those movements in a really interesting way. And in general, I just think that these ideas are a lot more closely related than we often want to think they are. Sadly, I think the modern anti-vax movement, and particularly the sort of magical thinking around COVID-19 itself and cures for COVID-19 are very indicative of magical thinking under the guise of scientific research.
I don't need ivermectin unless I get sick. And it's been proven over and over and over again that people that take that at the very beginning of their COVID sickness is well within 2 to 3 days. And they don't suffer all the crap and the death and the need to be put on a ventilator. I mean, they're well. They're well. They're cured. And you don't want me to take the cure. That's unreasonable, man.
The second way that I think Scientology has really fascinated me the more I've learned more about it is that I feel like Scientology is an incredibly American religion. So Scientology obviously originated from Americans. It is dominated by Americans even to this day. But I think to explain what about Scientology particularly fascinates me and really makes me reflect on kind of the underlying cultural values that I have as an American goes back to an idea that I'm sure you guys have all heard of called the Protestant work ethic, and how that has been an integral part of American culture ever since the Puritans. So the Protestant work ethic comes from Max Weber's book, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and the Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as the Protestant ethic in sociological theory is the value attached to hard work, thrift, and efficiency in one's worldly calling, which, especially in the Calvinist view, were deemed signs of an individual's election or eternal salvation. Basically, in Calvinistic modes of Christianity, which the Puritans were certainly a part of, we could go down a whole rabbit hole here, but I think the dominant Puritan culture certainly is very Calvinistic. Really, there's a kind of dualism that is ingrained in American Christianity from its earliest days, and therefore I think American culture writ large. So I realized after my original filming, I think that I was not sufficiently taking into account the really dominant cultural narratives we have around the Puritans and asceticism, which is sort of, think austerity, monk-like. I think we have this idea that the Puritans were very Spartan in their approach to worldly goods or worldly things. And while I do agree that Puritans have a certain ascetic aesthetic, when you think of the Puritans, you're not thinking of super lavish people. That doesn't mean that the Puritans didn't really value wealth and have very strong ideas about what wealth said about an individual, their worthiness, their holiness, etc. I mean, even just thinking about when you think of the typical Puritan, you're thinking of the sort of like stripped down linen look, the black and the white. That linen was not cheap. To have linen that bleached and beautiful and white was a sign of wealth. Mina Lee actually did a really interesting video recently talking about how having clean underwear throughout history has been a sign of social status. So it's an easy trap to fall into to assume that just because somebody's not dripping in gold, it means that they don't care about wealth or don't have ideas about metaphysical significance of being wealthy. There's actually a really good summary article of this that came out in like 2004, I think, in The Guardian that I'll link below, but it's basically talking about the sort of misalignment between the perceptions of what it meant to be a Puritan and the actual economic realities of that that in terms of their ideology. Basically, yeah, they didn't have ostentatious clothes. They were always trying to close down the theaters, and they seem to just like live to be killjoys in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean that they don't actually have a very strong correlation in their rise of their ideology with actually the kind of rise of capitalism writ large. In fact, it talks a lot about how Puritanism was actually kind of a outgrowing of that economic transformation, and how Puritanism as a religious ideology really was an ideology of the commercial classes. Bankers, merchants, industrialists, etc. Puritanism was their ideology. It was a manifestation of a form of Calvinism. And keep in mind, the Reformation were like, 100-ish years out when some of these ideas about capitalism and Puritanism are fomenting. It's all an outgrowth of this sort of revolution of ideas that was the Protestant Reformation in Europe. So in terms of how the Puritans themselves specifically interpreted Calvinist doctrine, Calvin had given Puritans what the old order could not, a theological justification of commerce. Capitalism in his teachings was not unchristian, but could be used for the glorification of God. From his doctrine of individual purification, the late Puritans forged a new theology. At its heart was an idealization of personal responsibility before God. This rapidly turned into a theory of individual rights in which the traditional scheme of Christian values was almost never reversed. By the mid-17th century, most English Puritans saw in poverty not a misfortune to be pitied and relieved, but a moral failing to be condemned, and in riches, not an object of suspicion, but the blessing which rewards the triumph of energy and will. And this is actually a pretty logical outflowing of what the Reformation really stirred up, which was an increasing emphasis on the individual rather than people being merely a part of the overall social fabric or sort of cog in the machine of society writ large. That kind of individualism in religion then correlated to individualism in sort of secular morality writ large and downward trajectory of emphasizing social cohesion rather than individual merit and salvation. And then on top of that, Puritans made a pretty direct correlation from that religious ideology to commerce and prosperity in general. They conflated their religious calling with their commercial one. Next to the saving of his soul, the preacher Richard Steele wrote in 1684, "The tradesman's care in business is to serve God in his calling, and to drive it as far as it will go. Success in business became a sign of spiritual grace, providing proof to the entrepreneur, in Steele's words, that God has blessed his trade." Tawney, who wrote a really important book about this in the 20s called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, also describes the Puritans as early converts to administrative nihilism, the doctrine that we would now call the minimal state. Business affairs, they believed, should be left to be settled by businessmen, unhampered by the intrusions of an antiquated morality. They owed nothing to anyone. Indeed, they formulated a radical new theory of social obligation, which maintained that helping the poor created idleness and spiritual dissolution, divorcing them from God. So I hope that makes a little clearer the connection that I'm trying to make between Puritans as being a foundational influence on American culture in general, and this view of wealth as reification of your position with God. I think that in popular conceptions, there's a tendency to see the distance between Puritanism and something like the prosperity gospel as being quite vast. But actually, the prosperity gospel, which very directly argues and preaches that physical wealth, prosperity, etc., is a direct one-to-one reflection of how blessed you are by God, and really, even in some extreme forms, your salvation in general. Kate Bowler has a kind of dry but very interesting overall history of the movement of the prosperity gospel if you're interested in learning more about that. But I think that in popular imagination, there's a real distance between Puritanism and that other very American form of Christianity, which is the prosperity gospel. But really, what I'm trying to argue is that there is a lot in common in terms of the underlying assumptions about the relationship between wealth and one's relationship to God, meaning that wealth equals blessedness. Wealth equals moral superiority because you as the individual have conquered the material world with God's approval. And so it is a very American form of religion, and consequently has also very much influenced American secularism, this unconscious association of wealth as goodness. I think that this may get into why Americans do just love being very ostentatious with our wealth. ContraPoints has made a very interesting video about the concept of opulence in American culture and American politics writ large, and I think that it's not a coincidence that this is something Americans are predisposed to, given some of the historical historical roots our culture has to ideas of affluence being associated with holiness. Just because the aesthetic of success has shifted from austerity to opulence doesn't mean that the underlying ideology or principles are not very similar. Hopefully this is a helpful tangent to make more explicit these connections between the Protestant work ethic, Puritanism, and this overall American value of wealth as a moral good. Now, dualism is kind of a recurring theme in Christianity in general over its thousands of years of existence, and that dualism, I think, really comes from early Gnostic threads of Christian ideology. That version of Christianity has really dominated a lot of different sects, not S-E-G-G-S, S-E-C-T-S, Christian sects who view the body as intrinsically shameful, suspicious, or sinful. So what is Gnosticism? Basically, Gnosticism's common cosmology has three elements. There's an unknowable supreme being, there is a good spiritual realm, often referred to as the pleroma, and the evil physical realm. But ultimately, this approach really becomes pretty dualistic because human beings can't have access to that unknowable supreme being. Therefore, they're really only interacting with the pleroma and the evil physical world. You can see clear roots of this way of thinking, by the way, all the way back in Plato's time, the whole Platonic forms with the ideals versus the janky photocopies of the ideals in the physical world. But Gnosticism itself is more of a Middle Eastern kind of philosophical tradition that arose kind of in the early days of the Roman Empire. So don't necessarily associate this directly with Plato, but I think all of this kind of got melanged into one big dualistic thread that will continue in cultures that are dominated by Christianity and its philosophy for years to come up through to today. Spilling my La Croix all over my face, but I don't care because it's hot as balls in here today and your girl's gotta cool down. Because the human mind and body are fallen, or in that evil physical realm, you have to have this divine knowledge of the pleroma, which is called gnosis, hence Gnostic, gnosis, that is revealed to this sort of elect few who are able to receive that wisdom, which is often referred to as the logos. So in most Gnostic systems, there is a divine embodiment of wisdom, sometimes called the Sophia, sometimes called other things, that will impart that gnosis to a Gnostic leader. So for example, in Gnostic versions of Christianity, that Gnostic leader would be Jesus. And then that Gnostic leader reveals the way to the pleroma via the gnosis. We got the pleroma, which is where we gotta go. It's the good place, if you will. We're all down here in the bad place. The pleroma is the good place, and the bridge, Scientology pun, from the bad place to the good place is the gnosis, and you need the Gnostic leader to tell you where that gnosis is. But also remember that usually that Gnostic leader is not a savior in the same way that we would think of like Jesus in Christianity. Rather, the individual frees themselves via that gnosis. So they need someone to show them where the gnosis is, but they themselves have to do the work to achieve the gnosis, to reach the pleroma, and not everybody can do this. It's only the pneumatic or the divinely elect, gets called a lot of different things, who are able to even see the gnosis. So basically he's seeking freedom from the material world to become a kind of god almost, not so that they can ultimately know the supreme being, but more just like as an end unto itself. So basically Gnosticism often is talked about as religion, but I think that that's honestly not the best way to think of it. It's really more of a philosophical science that gets infused into a lot of different other religious and spiritual movements. So there's this dude called Van Groningen, who has a framework defining the difference between religion, philosophy, and science. So in his opinion, religion is mostly concerned with the relationship between God and humans. Philosophy is concerned with the relationship between humans and the universe. And then science is really the methods by which humans seek to know and control God and or the universe, because science can exclude an idea of God, but at minimum, it's trying to know and control the universe. So really, Gnosticism is not strictly religious. It's more philosophical at best, but it's really kind of a scientific end. It's trying to properly characterize and classify the physical and spiritual world so that humans can know and control it. So Gnosticism is often associated with basically Christian heresy, but I would argue that really you should think of it as sort of a flavor that could be incorporated into any number of religious or philosophical traditions, and it has been over time. And I would also argue that Gnosticism sort of used early Christianity as an incubator for its thoughts, whereas Scientology as a kind of Gnostic religion used early psychiatry and psychology as an incubator for a lot of its thoughts. The reason I think that America really is pretty Gnostic in a lot of its core mythology or core cultural shared identity is that there is this core American story about this rugged individualism where the individual seeks mastery over the physical universe, which usually manifests itself in the acquisition and growth of money, to signify a kind of personal morality. In the context of Christianity, kind of a personal righteousness or holiness, but I think in secular American culture, an overall just mastery of the physical realm manifesting in physical rewards. So I think that's a very American thing in general, but in particular, Scientology I think takes a lot of those impulses and really revs it up to the next level. So for instance, the origins of psychiatry and psychology have some very Gnostic elements to them. You can look at particularly Carl Jung and the influence of Gnosticism on his thinking, but I think you can also map a lot of what Scientology is about pretty directly onto Gnosticism. Even their names are analogous. So Gnosticism is actual Greek that was coined by Saint Irenaeus when he was critiquing Gnostic cults. A Gnostic is the one who knows, versus Scientology is a Latin Greco-neologism mashup that Scientologists say means knowing how to know. In Scientology, you have pretty similar cosmology to Gnosticism. There is an unknowable supreme being, there is a good spiritual universe composed of energy, which is referred to as theta, and there is the bad physical realm referred to as mest, which if I'm remembering rightly stands for matter, energy, space, and time. In this cosmology, the supreme being created pure spiritual beings called Thetans, who in turn accidentally created the physical universe and trapped themselves in human bodies, which if they are supposed to be perfect, like how did this accident happen? I guess I shouldn't ask that. Side note, I had to turn on the fan because my camera keeps overheating. Let's hope that I can get through the rest of this, but sorry if the sound got worse. So anyway, these Thetans are trapped in human bodies. So really, human bodies are just sort of like meat vehicles that Thetans are driving. Thetans are actually reincarnated thousands and thousands of times into different human bodies. So the idea of Scientology is that the Thetan is going to rid itself of the negative past experiences in its mind so that it can achieve spiritual freedom by being able to directly communicate with theta. And at that point, the mind essentially becomes like a computer. It has perfect recall. It has no past hangups of any kind. And this state is called clear. And once you reach the state of clear, you actually move, according to Scientology, onto the next state of human evolution, which is becoming a homo novus rather than a homo sapien. The only way to get to clear, however, is the bridge. And the bridge is the gnosis in this version of Gnosticism, and the individual Thetan has to follow the preset gnosis laid out by L. Ron Hubbard in order to achieve this spiritual freedom. And he is revered as this set of knowledge's only source. To do that, you've got to take all of these classes, you have to submit to auditing, which is basically a kind of one-on-one counseling that has very specific questions that a lot of people think induces a kind of trance-like hypnosis. I know that L. Ron Hubbard was definitely very interested in the topic of hypnosis when he was younger. Seems like there's a lot of kind of back and forth as to if that's what's happening in these auditing sessions, if you're sort of like self-hypnotizing or at least going into some kind of trance through the repetition of questions. But who knows? I've never done auditing. I have no idea exactly what's happening there. But you basically use this sort of rudimentary lie detector test thing that they call an e-meter. Scientologists believe is like this very precise scientific machine that can show you what is happening in your thoughts. So basically, as Scientologists progress in their knowledge, this gnosis, which is called the bridge, they become increasingly in control of their own mind and body, and they also can affect control, they believe, on the mind and body of others. So in other words, Scientology's path is not actually to get to God, it's to walk this bridge, which is a path to full self-actualization, full enlightenment, and full communication with their perfect spiritual selves. Which, again, I do feel like has a lot of parallels to kind of the secular version of American culture, where if you follow this specific path, which is often called the American dream, you will achieve perfect success, which is a manifestation of your own personal kind of like sanctimony or goodness or worthiness, this ideal, materialistically rich life. And Scientology actually even codifies this idea of elite levels of society being reached through hard work and money, because literally this bridge consists of different levels that you have to pay to get to and then go through like hundreds of hours of auditing to get to. So you're walking this path and you literally have a codified hierarchy of who is the most spiritually enlightened. You know that they are also pouring a tremendous amount of their physical material wealth into getting there.
And you're off to the next person, which is the National Association of Scientologists registrar, who is going to pitch you about how you need to improve your status because you are merely a humanitarian with honors.
Right.
And you need to become a patron gigatorius. And for today only, just until Thursday at 2 o'clock, though a patron gigatorius is actually $100,000, and you so far have given us $60,000 just for this week. If you give us just $20,000, we will bump you up to patron gigatorius, which is $100,000 status. So you will have the status of being a patron gigatorius for only $20,000. But this offer is only good until Thursday at 2 o'clock.
It also just feels intensely individualistic. So like your goal is your own personal self-actualization, whatever, which I get. I feel like really parallels a lot of what American cultural values are. This intense, rugged individualism where you're striking out on your own and you're the one who is like discovering things and making your own way, you know, sort of the valorization of the kind of pioneering spirit, I feel like is very present in Scientology and also very present in American culture writ large. So anyway, that's like a whole long version of saying, I feel like Scientology really reflects the overall sort of dualism that a lot of Americans have very baked into us that come from our kind of Puritan roots, which are indirectly influenced from thousands of years of this philosophical tradition that's intensely dualistic or Gnostic. Whether or not that's what people actually are professing, I feel like that's sort of the ghost behind a lot of both American religion and American culture. And to me, Scientology really manifests and sort of represents that impulse pretty directly. And then the last element of my fascination with Scientology is intensely personal. And this is the one that I've always known, but hadn't necessarily reflected on that much until recently reading this book and me kind of thinking about it anew. And that is that Scientology was a critical mirror for me to reflect on my own religious experiences up to that point, and over the last 10 years to really change them. I grew up in fundamentalistic evangelicalism, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. I grew up very specifically believing that there was only one way to heaven. Hell had a very specific meaning. Salvation had a very specific valence to it, and that there was this one way, and if you did not follow this way, you would be lost, condemned, unredeemed, whatever language. And being very sincere in that way of thinking and very committed to that ideology was something that caused me a lot of psychic distress, because what I cognitively believed was constantly at war with what I intuitively and emotively felt and my existential experience of the world around me. And that was leading to a level of intense cognitive dissonance where I had a very specific belief set that I wanted to ascribe to, but I didn't actually feel that aligned with my personal ethics in a lot of ways. Studying Scientology gave me this distance to be able to study a high control religious subgroup that in a lot of ways mirrored my own high control religious subgroup, where there's constant policing of what you can and can't think, what you can and can't say, what you can and can't do. And of course, some of that is intrinsic to religious belief in general, but what I'm talking about is a high control version of that, where you even have a level of self-indoctrination, where even thinking or considering a different point of view takes on a kind of spiritual freight to it that creates what Lawrence Wright in his book calls a prison of belief. This idea that I can only believe this one thing, and if I don't, these are the consequences for it, so I can't even think about something else. If I even think about something else or consider that something else could be true, it is an imminent threat to my own kind of conception of self or conception of safety. This is actually something that I feel like Amanda Montell really captures nicely in her book Cultish, because she talks a lot about how the language of cults drives thought policing, and Scientology is the master of this. So for instance, like one of the examples they have is of being reasonable, and this idea that being reasonable is bad because being reasonable means that you can be logicked out of just blindly adhering to the tenets of the overall belief system. I found it through studying Scientology that there were a lot of examples of that within the version of Christianity that I grew up in. This idea of what freedom meant. Conventionally, I think we all kind of know what the word freedom means, but some of the language that's often used in fundamentalistic evangelicalism to define freedom is defined as all these things that you can't or shouldn't do. Ultimately, freedom becomes being free to be a good evangelical Christian, not actually freedom to be yourself, to think what you want, to examine other points of view. It's free to follow this very specific predefined path.
You're driving the car. It's just that you don't realize that the car, as a Scientologist, because you're in the trap, it's got a pre-rigged route. It's called the bridge. And so you feel like this is this easy life. I just got to sit here and the car basically drives itself. All I got to do is show up at the church and I'll be happy. And there you are. And you're on the bridge to total freedom. To total freedom. Yeah, they free you from yourself.
That's one of the brutally ironic things about Scientology when they have a slogan called "Think for Yourself."
Yeah.
And you find yourself thinking exactly what Scientology wants you to think.
No, but you're doing it yourself. That's why it's pretty good. I mean, it's really insidious.
This book basically just really reminded me when I was reading it of how much language is used to signal your in-group status. So you see a lot of these TikToks where ex-evangelicals will have these skits about specific language used for prayer or language used to talk about different morals or ethics within the in-group. That's pretty natural, I think, for any in-group. You develop a sort of kind of jargon or language, but I think this book really reminded me that that can take on an insidious level to it when it's meant to give you thoughts that are not really your own, but are actually kind of implanted from the group you're a part of. Because ultimately that begins to reshape how you define your own experience rather than using the language that's like native to yourself and to your own thought patterns. I really like the term cult-ish that this uses, both because it's indicating a certain kind of language, and she's a linguist, so obviously that's her focus, but then it also, I think, is a nice descriptor of a lot of high control groups that you may or may not be able to concretely define as a cult, but that definitely have cult-like qualities to them. There are so many definitions of cults out there, and I think people get really defensive about it, which I totally understand, because really all religion exists on kind of a spectrum of cultishness. All religions are cults to some degree. Some of them are just higher control than others. But one kind of definition that I've landed on that I think is pretty close to what I mean by when I say cult is this idea that there is no flavor of that religious, spiritual, or philosophical belief that is not fundamentalistic. And fundamentalistic, I basically mean that there are no versions of that religion that are not high control over the individual members of that religion's life. There is no being a whatever outside of the kind of preset structure, hierarchy of that group. And if you veer outside of both that hierarchy and that hierarchy's beliefs, you are considered to be shunned, kicked out, etc. Basically, a cult to me is a group where there are only fundamentalists. And when I have been reflecting on this over the last few weeks, it did raise a lot of concerns for me and a lot of, I think, new resonance as to why I ultimately couldn't stay in evangelical Christianity. The kind of text of the history of American fundamentalism is this book by George Marsden called Fundamentalism and American Culture. And one thing he talks about in this book is both fundamentalism per se, which is a very specific kind of evangelical Christianity that arose in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, and then had a resurgence in the 70s. He talks about that movement in particular, but then he also gives this language of fundamentalistic evangelicalism. And he argues that that was a dominant mode of Christianity from the 1950s onwards. And I have to say, his book stops roughly in the 70s, but I think Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumez makes a really successful argument that that fundamentalistic evangelicalism came to be the dominant mode of American Christianity, kind of vibrant practicing American Christianity from the 1980s onwards. There's also some interesting hints of this in Molly Worthen's book, Apostles of Reasons, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism. But in terms of a straight up history, I think that this pretty persuasively argues that increasingly mainstream Christianity may not be fundamentalism strictly speaking, because fundamentalism, not only in Christianity, but I think in general, tends to be a somewhat insular experience of religion where there's an us versus them with society, and there's a withdrawal from society to some degree. That's kind of where the cliche of like cults going on a ranch, think Waco or Jonestown or something like that. That's sort of a cliche, but I think it's sort of that withdrawal from culture, whereas evangelicalism hasn't withdrawn from culture, right? Like in America, there's this resentment that cultural forces outside of evangelicalism are highly influential on mainstream American culture because evangelicalism really wants to be the dominant shaper of American culture writ large. This is where you get a lot of rhetoric around, I want my country back, all that kind of stuff. Between Marsden and Dumez, we have a pretty persuasive argument that while the dominant mode of evangelicalism in America isn't fundamentalism per se, it is highly influenced by a lot of fundamentalistic forces. I think in studying Scientology, I was able to look at some of those elements a lot more honestly and without a lot of the same fear that I could when I was looking at my own religious group. Because there is the same kind of elitism. There is the same us versus them mentality. Maybe in evangelicalism, I was reborn instead of a homo novus, but there were a ton of striking parallels. And I think the reason why this video in particular has been one that I have rewatched so many times is that this is an interview that actor Jason Begay did roughly a year after he came out of Scientology when he was still decompressing from a lot of it. And his emotions and anger and hurt and confusion were so raw. There's this one moment in the interview that at the time I don't think I could fully claim for myself in terms of fully relating to it. But as I was rewatching it in preparation for this video, I was really struck by how many times I would pause and rewatch this specific segment over and over again and how much it reverberated through me.
Scientology was developed in 1952, but LRH was doing Dianetics. I'm having a moment. See, this is part of the moments of coming out of Scientology, for me at least. I think it might be something common to a lot of people, but there are moments where you just feel a loss. And it's not a loss of, I miss Scientology by any stretch. It's a loss. It's a regret of having invested so much in something that is empty. And so there are these moments, and I just had one, where you just go,
These days, I definitely don't identify as an evangelical. I think I identify as some kind of Christian in terms of philosophical traditions. I'm not really sure. So I wouldn't say that I look at my time in evangelicalism as a waste or totally empty, but I think ultimately what it promised was freedom in Christ. And I think that this interview in particular helped me find the language to say that what I was experiencing was not freedom in any commonly defined sense of that word. So why am I so obsessed with Scientology? I've tried to explore a few different avenues explaining why this has been such a intellectually and personally fascinating subject to me. But I think in the end, I have to just say that through it, I see so many reflections of the parts of my cultural and religious formation that are difficult for me to see when I try to look at them directly. I see in Scientology the worst parts, the things I least like about my identity as an American, as someone with a history of trauma seeking healing from it, and as someone raised in a fundamentalistic religion. So my own experiences are something that are just difficult for me to be fully aware of, as I think it's difficult for all of us when we're thinking about our own experiences. But Scientology and the stories of people who have gotten out of that movement and talked about the ways that they've personally found it harmful to them have given me an avenue to explore my own experiences in ways that I may not have had the wherewithal or maybe sometimes even the courage or honesty to look at without the lens of somebody else's story. So I think that's why I'm obsessed with Scientology. Also, I mean, you've seen that South Park episode. There's some crazy shit in there that's just generally interesting to gawk at. Anyway, that was my little trip down memory lane with a religion that is not my own, but that I've been very interested in. I will definitely have a ton of links listed below with podcasts that you might be interested in. I've really enjoyed the Fair Game podcast and the Aftermath show that Leah Remini and Mike Rinder have done. Going Clear is great. I'll have some of my favorite YouTube videos linked below, as well as a list of the books that I referenced in and throughout this video for those who are interested in reading more. I would definitely be interested to hear your experience with, I guess, religion in general, which is kind of a big nebulous question, but if you're somebody who's not religious, I'd be interested to hear if you are fascinated with some of these fringe religious or philosophical movements the way that I am, or if you're somebody who has grown up with religion or even is still religious. I'd be interested to hear your response to some of the things that I talked about today. So definitely let me know your thoughts below. You can follow me on social media at Books Like Whoa, pretty much everywhere. Love to hear from you guys. If you like this kind of video, which is a new format for me, definitely let me know. Thumbs up, hit the bell, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, I will catch you guys later. Bye!